Killing Them Gently, a supernatural mystery of horror and suspense. Written by Thomas Fincham. Narrated by Stephen Michael Preston. Bleeding Them Gently, Episode 9. My mind raced through a million thoughts. I had now caught a break, and that break came in the form of a used cigarette butt. I lifted a clear plastic bag. It held evidence I had taken from the house of my now dead friend, Raymond Chan. Ray's assailant had used this very cigarette to burn and torture him. He had also used this cigarette for his personal use. I was counting on this because that would provide me with the DNA I needed to track him. By finding Ray's killer, I would also find who had shot me. The shooter had turned me from Peter Murphy to Alex Weller. 12 bullets ripped through Peter's body. Thanks to a guardian angel who went by the name of Royce, I was given a second chance as Alex Weller. Detective Murphy of the Clydesdale Police Department had a house with a wife and son. Detective Weller of the Clayton Police Department was alone and lived in his Escalade. I looked around the car's interior and wondered how many days and nights I had spent inside it. My deal with Royce was to solve strange and unexplainable crimes. In return, he would miraculously make Peter Murphy better. This way I could get back to Rosie and Maddie. So far, I had done everything Royce had asked of me, in the hope that it would soon be all over. That was why I was sitting in my Escalade now. I was waiting for Royce to show up. But I had a feeling that he may not. He had, on numerous occasions, failed to appear. Today felt like it would be no different. I was rubbing my eyes when I felt something next to me. I reached for my gun. "There is no need for that," a deep but soothing voice said. It was Royce. He was sitting in the passenger seat, dressed in his usual attire, white suit, white tie, and white shoes. "Where the hell have you been?" I demanded. "I've been busy," he replied. Busy? I was ready to lose my cool. "I've been waiting for you to show up for heaven knows how long. Do you have any idea that my best friend Ray is dead?" "Yes, but what do you want me to do about it?" he said. I was taken back by his reply. He said, "What happened to Raymond Chan was your responsibility. His involvement had nothing to do with me. You put him in the predicament he's currently in." In some ways, he was right. I had reached out to Ray, and because of that, he paid with his life. "Can you do something to help Ray?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Royce said. "Do what you did for me. You gave me a second chance at life. Give Ray another chance." "We don't work like that," he shook his head. I slammed my palm on the dashboard. "Come on. I'll do whatever you want. It was my fault. I get it. Ray shouldn't be punished for it." "I'm sorry. There is nothing I can do." "Please," I pleaded. "If you want, I'll solve more cases, however many more you want, in return for you giving Ray his life back." Royce looked at me hard. "Let me explain something to you. We are not in the business of making deals at the snap of a finger. You were chosen because you possess skills that we required. Our agreement was only between us. Your friend was never supposed to be part of any of this. You made him a part of this, and for that, you will have to live with the consequences." Royce stared out the window. I did so too. I knew the position I was putting Royce in. He had given me an opportunity to be Peter Murphy again. If I had stuck to the script, which involved not trying to find out who had shot Peter Murphy, Ray might have still been alive. "Peter Murphy is recovering nicely," he finally said. I faced him. He continued, "I wanted to let you know that soon you may be able to go back to your old life." This was the best news I'd had in a long time. In fact, after everything I'd been through, I felt a flicker of hope bubble inside me. What Royce was saying now was that my nightmare could come to an end. I could finally go back to Rosie and Maddie. "Speaking of which, do you know anything about my wife and son?" I asked. "They are doing well," he said. This was the best news someone could have given me. I didn't know how much time and energy I had spent trying to find them. Ever since Ray told me he hadn't had any contact with them, the constant worry about their whereabouts had worn me down. "Where are they now?" I asked. They haven't left Peter Murphy's bedside. They were with me. I let out a sigh of relief. I couldn't help but smile. I turned to thank Royce. I was confronted with an empty seat. Once again, Royce had come and gone. No matter. I had said and heard what I needed to. My cell phone rang. I pulled it out and answered it. "Weller," I said. I listened. "Okay, I'm on my way." Instead of putting the escalating gear and driving away, I paused for a moment. I felt a little giddy, and I laughed. Rosie and Maddie are okay. And I'm with them. They had not lost hope. They believed that I would make it through and we would be a family again. This thought was more powerful than anything I could have imagined. It gave me renewed energy. Whatever came my way now, I could deal with it. I turned the key in the ignition and drove out of the spot I was parked in. I slowed the Escalade when I reached a modest neighborhood, and some even had painted fences. I parked by the side of the street and saw a group of people standing in front of a house. They were dressed casually, with some still in their pajamas. I quickly concluded that the gawkers were from the neighboring houses. I flashed my badge to an officer and ducked underneath the yellow police tape. I spotted Superintendent Brian Davis by the front door. Normally, Davis would be talking to his wife on the phone. Today, this was not the case. Maybe his wife was doing better. She had suffered from mental health issues, so I never minded how long he took talking to her. When I approached him, Davis said, "You look like you're having a good day." I suppose the good news Royce had given me was still lingering on my face. I couldn't help but not feel positive today. I smiled. "I am. And what has your day been like?" He gave me a once-over. "I'm always having a good day, Weller. You should know that by now." "My mistake," I said, rolling my eyes. "Miranda's waiting for you inside." Detective Miranda Butterfield was in the living room. Miranda was my partner on these cases I was solving for Royce. She knew very little about my history, and even less about who I really was. I had kept Miranda in the dark for her own safety. I had come to trust her, and the last thing I needed was for her to be involved in my mess. Ray had already paid dearly for it. I didn't want her to suffer too. 2 other people were in the living room as well. Miranda turned to them. "Mr. and Mrs. Darrows, this is Detective Alex Weller. He will be working on the case with me." I nodded to them. Mr. Darrows had his arm around his wife's shoulders. She was busy wiping tears from her eyes. "Excuse us," Miranda said. She took me upstairs. "It's not pretty," she said. "It never is." "No, this." She paused. I looked at her. She looked shaken. "What's wrong?" I asked. "She's just a kid." Miranda bit her bottom lip as if to control her emotions. I was surprised by Miranda's reaction. She and I had been through many strange and bizarre cases. I'd never once seen her upset by one. "What's her name?" I finally asked. "Hannah Darrows. She's 15 years old." "Okay," I said. "Do you want me to go alone?" Miranda nodded. "Yeah, I just need a minute." "No problem." I entered the room and saw how bright and colorful it was. There were posters of boy bands plastered on the walls. A young girl was lying on the bed. She was still in her pajamas. Her face was twisted to the side. When I went around to get a better look, I had to catch myself from screaming. The girl's face was no more. It looked as if all her features had bled away. I couldn't see any eyelids, nose, lips, nothing. What was left was a blank mask. Even though it was difficult, I tried to focus my attention on the other parts of her body. She had jet black hair, and each of her fingernails were painted a different color. But no matter how hard I tried, I went back to her missing face. "How could that have happened?" I heard Miranda's voice. She was standing by the door. She avoided looking at the girl. I shook my head. "I don't know." I walked around the room and stopped by the dressing table. I scanned the makeup and cream scattered on top of it. I picked up a small jar, unscrewed the cap, and sniffed. It smelled pleasant. I said, "We should bag everything in here and take it back to the lab." "You think it's something she put on her face?" Miranda asked. I shrugged. "I don't know, but it's the best place to start." Is there anything you can tell us about your daughter? Miranda asked. We were back in the living room, seated across from the victim's parents. What would you like to know? Mr. Darrow said. Was she having problems at school? Did she have any enemies? What was her social circle like? Mr. Darrow shook his head. If you knew our daughter, you would know instantly that everyone liked. No, everyone loved her. He looked over at his wife. Without even saying a word, I could tell they knew what the other was thinking. Mrs. Darrow got up and left the room. After many years of marriage, Rosie and I had that connection. Without uttering a single sentence, we could communicate with each other. We knew, no, we felt what the other was feeling. It was intuitive. Mrs. Darrow returned. In her arms was a large gray album. She placed it on the coffee table before us. She flipped the first page, and we saw what our victim looked like. Hannah was beautiful. She had a certain glow to her. Her eyes were alive and vibrant. Her smile, even though covered in braces, was attractive and striking. I couldn't help but feel for her parents. Mrs. Darrow flipped through the pages, and with each new page, we got a better idea of who Hannah was. The faceless girl upstairs was once a young woman who lived and loved life. There was not a single photo of Hannah Darrow without a smile. What happened to her was nothing short of utter tragedy. Did Hannah have a boyfriend? Miranda asked. Not recently, Mrs. Darrow said. She had a crush on a boy years ago, but his family moved away and he ended up going to another school. Also, if she liked someone, she would have told us about him. Miranda nodded. In the last couple of days, did you notice anything different about Hannah? I mean, was she sad, angry, upset? Anything out of the ordinary? No, Mr. and Mrs. Darrow shook their head in unison. In fact, Mrs. Darrow said, she was more upbeat than usual. Why do you think that was? Miranda said. Mrs. Darrow said, you see, every year her school has a big dance, and Hannah was so excited about it. She had even gone out and bought a dress with her friends. Miranda said, can you give us the names of your daughter's friends? Sure, Mrs. Darrow said. She turned to her husband and tears formed in her eyes again. How are we going to tell them what happened to Hannah? They will be devastated. She then broke down crying. Miranda got up, signaling the end of the interview. We both knew they needed some time to grieve. We can get the names at a later time, she said. We are sorry for your loss. We went out on the front porch. We felt like we could breathe again. Miranda was more shaken up than before. A young woman had her future stripped from her. She would never have the chance to fall in love, get married, have kids, or even have the opportunity to experience old age. I wanted to reach over and give Miranda a hug, but I was afraid of my own reaction. I didn't want to break down like her. One of us had to be strong now. Davis was standing on the front lawn. He came over. You saw the girl? He said. I wasn't in the mood for one of Davis's smart-ass comments, but instead he surprised me. It's just sad. I couldn't even look at her. It made me want to nail the prick who did it. We all wanted to punish the person who did this to Hannah Darrow. We were back at the detective division. Mrs. Darrow had provided us with her daughter's friends' names, but she requested that we wait until she broke the news to them first. This gave us some downtime. I left the division and found a quiet place on the other side of the building. I dialed Detective Ian Tanner's number and waited. Tanner was working on my case to find who had shot Peter Murphy. I now had evidence that linked my shooter and Ray's killer. They were the same person. I knew it with absolute certainty. When Tanner's voicemail came on, I quickly hung up. A thought passed through my mind and a shiver went down my spine. Ray had been tortured, but why? I knew the answer. His assailant wanted information, and I had a terrible feeling it was about me. Did Ray, under immense pressure, reveal who I really was? I suddenly felt like I was losing my breath. I pushed back to the wall to keep myself upright. My legs felt like they would give away at any moment. If Ray had given up my secret, the repercussions could be deadly. My sole advantage against my perpetrator was gone now. I could no longer work in the shadows. In fact, I, as Alex Weller, was now in danger too. I wasn't really concerned for my own safety, though. I could handle myself. I was now concerned for the safety of those around me. Miranda. Davis. Tanner. I quickly dialed his number again. After a few rings, his voicemail came back on. "Hey, it's Alex Weller," I said into the phone. "When you get this message, please call me back. It's important." I wanted to warn Tanner, but I was afraid to do it over the phone. My initial plan was to contact Tanner and hand over the evidence I had taken from Ray's house. I knew Tanner would have many questions, such as why I'd gone to Ray's house in the first place, but I wasn't concerned with that. I wanted Tanner to use the evidence to identify the person who had not only changed my life, but also ended Ray's. I couldn't do this on my own. There was no way I could get the Clayton PD to analyze the evidence. It would raise too many alarms. But he and Tanner could, and that was why I wanted to give it to him personally. I felt a pounding headache coming on. I took a deep breath and tried to clear my mind. I needed to think through this clearly. There was no indication that my cover had been blown. I needed to believe that. My objective was still the same: find Tanner and hand the evidence over to him. Now all I could do was wait for Tanner to return my call, so that I could put my plan in motion. When I returned, I found Miranda waiting for me by my desk. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Sure, why wouldn't it be?" I replied. "I don't know," she replied with a shrug. "It's just that I always find you sneaking away whenever we're on a case." "I wasn't sneaking away," I said. "Sorry, I meant excusing yourself from the case to do other things, which, as your partner and hopefully friend, I am not privy to." I sensed what Miranda was getting at, and I knew that one day I would have to deal with it. Miranda had been open about her personal life. I knew about her son and her marriage to Andrew. She, in turn, didn't know much about Rosie and Maddie. She had shared her life, and I had chosen not to. This resulted in a lopsided relationship. If I wanted her to continue trusting me, I had to give her something. I had to make a call. It was about my wife and son. Her eyes softened. "I hope everything is okay." I hadn't spoken to them for some time, and I was worried about them, but I found out everything was fine. Again, like I had done before, I gave Miranda something, but not everything. I had indeed not been able to speak to my wife and son. Again, like I had done before, I gave Miranda something, but not everything. I had indeed not been able to speak to my wife and son. I had, in fact, not any contact with them. Worried, I had made a trip to our house, whereby a friendly neighbor told me they had not been there for quite some time. It was only this morning that Royce had informed me that they were okay. So, in essence, I was truthful in what I shared with Miranda, but it was not enough for her to come to any conclusions. "I'm glad everything is okay," Miranda finally said. She then pulled out a piece of paper. "I was able to speak to one of Hannah's friends. She's okay about talking to us. I've got her address." "Let's go," I said. I was glad that we could finally start working on the case. Lucille Norton had freckled skin, auburn hair, and bright green eyes. She tried to smile whenever she spoke of Hannah, but the smile seemed tired. "Hannah was amazing," she said. "She was so full of life. Everything she did with so much enthusiasm." We were in the living room. Lucille's parents had moved into the kitchen, allowing us to talk to their daughter in private. Miranda said, "We are trying to find who might have done this to Hannah. Anything you tell us will be strictly confidential." I knew what Miranda was trying to do. She wanted the young woman to feel secure that nothing she said would come back to harm her. People her age had always been concerned about what their parents might find out, and we wanted Lucille to feel totally comfortable speaking with us. Was there anyone who might have not liked Hannah? Lucille thought about it, but then shook her head. No, Hannah was popular with everyone. The cool kids hung around her, but even the not-so-cool kids liked talking to her. She had a way about her. No matter who you were, she made you comfortable being with her. Miranda asked, "Did Hannah have a boyfriend?" Lucille looked toward the kitchen. We sensed she didn't want her parents listening in on this. "Please tell us," Miranda said, encouraging her. We have this big party coming up." I remembered it because Mrs. Darrows had mentioned it too. Hannah had been asked out by someone. "Who?" Miranda said. "Brad Hanson." "Hannah's parents never mentioned him," Miranda said. "Hannah didn't want anyone to know yet," Lucille said. "Brad is the coolest guy in school, and he's known to break a lot of hearts, you know. Hannah wanted to be sure first before she told anyone. The only reason I knew was because I saw her talking to him, so she had no choice but tell me why. Where can we find him? Miranda asked. The concrete park was located behind Hannah's school. Kids, mostly male, from all over came and skateboarded in the park. We approached a group of 4 or 5 boys doing jumps and tricks. They were all dressed casually with baggy jeans, t-shirts, and baseball caps turned backwards. They reminded me of what Matty would be like once he turned their age. In fact, he once asked if I could get him a skateboard. I told him he was too young for one, but we compromised and got him rollerblades instead. Which one of you is Brad? I asked. Miranda allowed me to take the lead, seeing that the boys might take me more seriously than her. A boy with long blonde hair and deep blue eyes said, "Who's asking?" I introduced us. 2 of the boys dashed away. We were relieved that Brad Hansen was not one of them. He stood where he was and stared in our direction. "What do you want?" he said. "We need to ask you a few questions about Hannah Darros." "What about her?" "She's dead." His mouth dropped. His voice trembled when he said, "Hannah is dead?" I nodded. "How?" I sensed the news had hit him hard. "We don't know, and that's what we're trying to find out," I said. "What was your relationship with her?" "None." "What do you mean?" "I only talked to her once. I asked her out to the dance, but she turned me down." "Did she say why?" He shrugged. "She thought I was a player. I'm not. She thought I would hurt her. I wouldn't." "How did that make you feel when she told you she didn't want to go with you?" "I was disappointed, but then I asked someone else out, Kathy Simpson." I looked over at Miranda, and she shook her head. This was another dead end. "How did she die?" Brad asked. "You don't want to know," I said, walking away. She sat by the window sipping a latte. The sun hit her face at the perfect angle, accentuating her porcelain skin. She had not one wrinkle on her. People thought she had used Botox, but that was not the case. Botox would have given her a frozen look, but instead she looked like she was still in her youth. She wasn't. She was taking another sip from the cup when she caught a young man looking in her direction. She had noticed him earlier, but now his attention toward her was no longer subtle. He was interested in her, and he wanted her to know it. She smiled, and he quickly took this as his cue and came over. He introduced himself. She was never good with names, but she did notice that he had broad shoulders and a wide chest. He must work out, she thought. He told her he had just passed his bar exam and was now working for a well-known law firm. She wasn't impressed, but naturally she wasn't going to let him know that. Men needed their egos inflated, and she made sure to do that. Over the years, she had been with business tycoons, oil barons, politicians, and countless lawyers, but in the end, she knew it wouldn't last. Her situation wouldn't allow her to be with them for long. They would never understand. In fact, they would be horrified if they ever found out. Contrary to popular belief, men wanted commitment, and most importantly, children. She could never give them that, not at her age now, so it was better to leave them before their relationship got to that stage. This left her feeling lonely, but it was the price she paid to be in the situation she was in now. She made small talk with the man, and in the end he left her his telephone number. She would call him. He would take care of her until she moved on to the next one. She caught her reflection in the windows. The area around her eyes looked like they were sagging. She realized she now needed more than one treatment to continue looking the way she did. She had to find another donor. She found her sitting 3 tables away. The young woman looked to be in her early 20s. The woman had that glow she had always looked for. She couldn't describe what this glow was, only that it was something that exuded youthfulness and vitality, 2 things she needed to continue her life that she had created for herself. Cynthia Young got up and approached the woman. Quickly, the 2 began chatting like they were best friends. The woman was not one bit afraid of her, and why would she be? Cynthia Young was a female, and she was extremely pleasant and friendly. The young woman's name was Abigail, but her friends called her Abby. Abby was a student at a nearby college. She was studying to be a registered nurse. She had a desire to help people. Cynthia, in return, told her that she owned a private salon not far from where they were now. In fact, they specialized in making women look and feel younger. If Abby ever dropped by, the first facial would be free of charge. Abby was more than appreciative of this offer. Abby had never spent money on getting done up. A haircut was the only extravagance she spent on. Cynthia gave Abby her business card. She then pulled out her appointment book, and after examining it, she told her that she had a spot open for later that same day if Abby was interested. Abby was more than interested. Cynthia smiled. Upon our return to the station, we were informed that the toxicology report of the creams taken from Hannah's room came back negative. There was nothing, no chemicals or dyes, that could have done that to her face. They contained ingredients that were safe and could be found in any product at the cosmetic store. Once again, we had nothing to go on. I pulled out my cell phone to check it. There were no calls from Tanner. I was getting more anxious. I knew excusing myself from the case would look suspicious, but I had no choice. In my Escalade, I had evidence that could identify the person who had destroyed my life. I couldn't ignore that now. I made some excuse to Miranda, but I knew she didn't believe me. Nevertheless, she had no authority to stop me, and Davis was not around to question me about it. So I left. I always hated doing this to Miranda, running around behind her back to do my errands, but I was so close now. I would be utterly foolish not to see it through. I drove straight to the Clydesdale Police Department. Throughout the drive, the only thought in my head was handing the evidence to Tanner and having him apprehend my and Ray's assailant. Maybe then I could also find out why I had been targeted. There was no other way of looking at it. Someone had lured me into that alley and ambushed me. No matter how hard I tried, I could never pinpoint the reasons why. I hoped that once this was all over, I would have some answers. But then the big question. Was I ready for those answers? I didn't know, but I would deal with that when the time came. At the moment, I had to find Tanner. I parked near the Clydesdale PD and went inside. I had already been to Tanner's office, so locating it was not a problem. It was empty. I found someone and realized he was also a detective. "Do you know where I can find Ian Tanner?" I asked. "He was here earlier, but I guess he's not back yet," the detective said. "If I were you, I'd give him a call." "I left him a message, but he hasn't answered," I said. "I'm sure he will," the detective said. "He's probably out on another case. You want to leave your name?" "It's okay," I said. I didn't want to leave any trace of having been here. "I'll try him again." I thought about waiting in Tanner's office, but I didn't know how long I'd have to wait. Miranda was not pleased with me leaving her, so I didn't want to exacerbate the situation any further. I decided to head back to Clayton. I exited the building and was on my way to my Escalade when I stopped. In the distance, I spotted a Ford 4x4. The person who had shot Peter Murphy drove a 4x4, and so did the person who I had once caught following me. I was positive it was the same person. From where I stood, I couldn't make out the driver inside the vehicle, but I was certain someone was behind the wheel. I turned and went back inside the police building. I searched and found the same detective whom I'd just spoken to earlier. I gave him a sealed envelope with the evidence that linked Peter Murphy's shooting and Ray Chan's killing. I requested the detective to personally hand it over to Tanner. I knew having it on me was no longer safe. I went to my Escalade knowing full well that I was being watched. I only hoped that the driver of the Ford 4x4 didn't realize that I was onto him. I needed the element of surprise. I left the parking lot and drove on the route that would take me back to Clayton. In the rearview mirror, I saw the 4x4 a couple of car lengths behind me. If I wasn't sure before that I was being followed, I was now more than convinced. I continued at my current speed, not wanting to go too fast or too slow. I wanted to see what the 4x4 would do next. Instead, it never got too close or strayed too far from me. It looked like it would follow me all the way back. It then occurred to me that there was an empty road between Clydesdale and Clayton. There was nothing but farmland on either side of this road. If the driver of the 4x4 had any devious ideas, that road would be the perfect place to execute them. I had to get a jump on him before he got a jump on me. I saw a cut in the road up ahead. I accelerated and turned onto it. Behind me, the 4x4 entered as well. I knew Clydesdale inside out. I had been living here for years, so I had the upper hand. I drove further up, moved through a roundabout, and entered the parking lot of an apartment building. Before I met Rosie, I had been a tenant in this very building for a couple of years. While living here, I had discovered a narrow path that led from the back of the building all the way to an adjacent street. I was driving on that path. If I was correct, the 4x4 would have passed the apartment building and was now on that adjacent street. I turned. I spotted the 4x4 up ahead. This was my chance. I sped up and rammed the 4x4 from behind. The 4x4 jerked forward. My plan was to box the 4x4 in. This way I could corner the driver. I wasn't sure if this was a good idea or not, but it was the only one I had for now. I accelerated and rammed the 4x4 again. The road would soon end, and I was hoping to make my final push then. I accelerated once again, and when I was about to ram the 4x4, it swerved left. I clipped the back of the bumper, causing the 4x4 to spin. It was then that I spotted something shiny, and I knew exactly what it was. The driver was holding a gun. He fired a shot, but at the speed he was spinning, the bullet just grazed my side door. I quickly pulled out my weapon, and as I moved past the 4x4, I fired 2 shots at it. The first one missed, but the second one blew out the left taillight. I was about to fire another round when I abruptly braked. I was at the end of the road, and if I didn't stop, I would go through the guardrail. The tires screeched as I pressed harder on the brakes. I turned the wheel. The Escalade's side slammed into the rail. I looked back and saw that the driver had the 4x4 back in control. He was racing away. I cursed and slammed my fist into the steering wheel. I got out and surveyed the Escalade. It had only suffered superficial damage. I would have no problem driving back to Clayton, which is what I did. She lay flat in the chair, staring up at the ceiling. Abby was excited. She was single and hoped that after this, her prospects would get better. It didn't help that Abby wasn't very sociable in the first place. She would rather have her head buried in a book than make the effort to talk to someone. She was very shy. She had been like this from the time she was young. Her parents never encouraged her to get out and make new friends. They themselves preferred to stay at home. Abby remembered sitting at home and watching old shows with her parents. They didn't have a large social circle, and it seemed Abby was destined to duplicate them. Cynthia Young appeared. She is stunning, Abby remembered thinking the first time she saw her. She was young, bright, and she had something that Abby wished she had: charisma. She had convinced Abby to come to the last place she thought she'd ever be in, a salon. "Are you ready?" Cynthia asked. "Yes," Abby replied with a smile. "Good." Cynthia first rubbed a cream all over her cheeks. The cream was kind of rough, but Abby didn't say anything. If Cynthia could make her skin look anything close to what her own skin looked like, Abby had no complaints. Cynthia turned on a machine. She told Abby the device would remove all the dirt and dead skin from her face. This would enable new, fresh skin to grow. Abby was all for it. The process wasn't pleasant, and in some instances, it was uncomfortable, but she didn't protest. "Your face is a little red, but that's normal," Cynthia said. Abby just nodded. Cynthia then applied a light cream over the bruised skin. The cream was cool and it tingled. She then disappeared from view. Abby closed her eyes and visualized what she would look like when her skin had healed. She also visualized what Cynthia had promised to do when she came for the next visit. That visit wouldn't be free, but somehow, some way, she would find the money to pay for it. She was tired of being alone, and she had come to trust Cynthia when she said her life would change from now on. Cynthia came back. She was holding what looked like a mask. It was oddly shaped and very old. "What is that?" Abby asked. "This will do the magic that you never thought was possible," Cynthia replied. "This will transform you." Abby liked the sound of that. "Please close your eyes." Abby did. The mask was placed on her face. It felt tight, and she thought she would suffocate, but she didn't say a word. She knew Cynthia was doing her a favor, and it would be rude to not appreciate it. Then, almost instantly, the mask felt like it had completely attached itself to her skin. She felt like clawing it off her face, but she gripped the chair tightly instead. The mask was hot. She could have sworn her face was on fire, but she didn't protest. The mask released its hold, and her skin could breathe again. Cynthia removed the mask and smiled at Abby. "It's done," she said. Abby sat up in the chair. She looked in the mirror and couldn't believe what she saw. She didn't look like her normal self, withdrawn and tired. Instead, the woman in the mirror was alive and radiant. "Thank you," Abby said, gently touching her skin. It was soft and smooth. "Thank you so much." Cynthia smiled. The pleasure was all mine. Abby went straight home. She felt great about herself. She couldn't wait to see what the new Abby would become. She knew there was still a lot to do before she completely changed, but this was at least a start. The first thing she did when entering her home was check herself in the mirror again. To her relief, she still looked the way she did at Cynthia Young's salon. She quickly changed. After checking her messages, she decided to go to bed. Sleep would be a challenge. She was still pumped up. But she had a midterm early in the morning. That was why she was studying at the cafe. She would have continued had Cynthia Young not approached her. No worries, though. She would get up early and do a quick read of the study material before heading to the exam. She soon fell asleep. She suddenly woke up. Her face was burning. She felt her skin, but it was cold to the touch. She got up and went to the bathroom. She looked in the mirror. To her horror, her face looked like it was falling off. She couldn't believe it. She looked old as her grandmother once looked. "This isn't possible," she thought. "It has to be a dream." But it was all too real. Her eyelids began to droop, her nose sagged, and her lips looked as if they were touching her chin. She tried to move her face, but it was too heavy. She wanted to cry, but no tears came out. She tried to scream, but she only managed to whimper. She looked like the creature in the Edvard Munch painting, The Scream. She reached for the phone and quickly dialed 911. The operator's voice came on, but she couldn't respond. She fell to the floor. Her eyelids had completely covered her eyes now. Her nose had twisted into a horrible shape, closing the air holes. Both her lips had melted and sealed themselves, shutting out all oxygen. She tried to claw at her deformed face with her fingernails, but it felt like cement. Abigail Helmsley could do nothing but wait until she drew her last breath. I sat in the Escalade thinking about what had just happened. I had come so close to finally being face to face with the man who had kept me from my family, and I blew it. I wanted to scream, pound the steering wheel, or even run the car into a wall. I wanted to destroy something, anything. I had never been so angry at myself. I knew the pain inside me was manifesting itself as rage. This rage was blinding me, but no matter how hard I tried to free myself of it, I only became angrier. I wanted to go home. I wanted to be with my wife and son. I was tired of only thinking about it. I wanted it to happen now. My cell phone rang, and for a brief second I didn't want to pick it up. But I did. "Weller," I said. It was Miranda. "We've got another one," she said. "Same MO as Hannah Darros." A part of me wanted to tell her to handle it herself. I had more urgent things to deal with, but I sensed that this might be good for me. I could focus my anger on finding who was behind these murders. Someone had done something horrible to Hannah's face, and who knew what shape this new victim was in. I could let the anger fuel me for something more productive. I started the Escalade and drove away. I parked at a low-end complex. When I reached the apartment, I found Miranda inside. "Her name is Abigail Helmsley," she said. I quickly spotted the victim. She lay on the floor in front of the bathroom. Her face, like Hannah's, had completely melted away. "She's 21, Miranda said. This was bad. Really bad. Another young woman had been brutally killed. There was no other way to say it. I tried to summon up an image of the perpetrator. It had to be a male and someone who was not pleasant to look at. A theory started to form. His advances must have been turned down by women, or maybe he had some trauma from childhood that was caused by women. He wanted to destroy the one thing they had, their beauty. But I knew this was all conjecture and nothing more. "Acid?" I said, turning to Miranda. "That's the first thing I thought too," she replied. "But we found nothing in the apartment, not even bleach." I moved around the interior. I stopped at the dining table. There was a backpack placed on top with a textbook next to it. Abigail was just a student. I felt sickened. Another person had been killed in their prime. I picked up the textbook and began to flip through it. I wasn't sure what I would find, but I kept going through the pages nonetheless. It was when I was near the end that something fell to the floor. I picked it up. It was a business card. I was about to place it back inside the textbook when my mind flashed back to Hannah's bedroom and something I'd seen on her dresser. I had seen this exact card before. CY Beauty Salon. The card had no telephone number, but it did have an address. "Miranda," I called out. "You find something?" she asked. I think I did. Cynthia stared at herself in the mirror. Her skin had begun to sag, and she could even see old age spots. "How long can I delay the inevitable?" she thought. The answer came back. "For as long as necessary." Cynthia had made a deal years ago. Decades ago, to be exact. She had wished to be beautiful so that she could win the heart of a boy in her village. Beauty hadn't come to her by nature, so she agreed to have it unnaturally. But it came with a price. It had to be taken from someone who possessed it, and that was what Cynthia Young had been doing ever since. She knew beauty required a lot of sacrifice. Unfortunately, the sacrifice had to come from someone else. She regretted what she did. Who wouldn't? Those girls did nothing to harm her, but she knew she had no other choice. If she stopped now, something far worse would happen to her. She lifted the mask. It had not changed from the day she first put it on many years ago. It was ancient. She had a feeling someone before her had used the powers of the mask. How and why that person stopped was beyond her. The mask gave her the ability to be young again. Who wouldn't want that? She closed her eyes and placed it over her face. Immediately it latched onto her skin, taking the shape of her face. Her face hurt as tiny pinpricks poked at her skin. No matter how many times she had been through the process, it never got any easier. The pain intensified when it felt like someone was scraping a layer off her face. She thought about pulling the mask off, but she knew it was no longer possible. She had to let the magical relic do its work. The pain finally ceased. The mask released its grip, and she felt nothing but coolness on her skin. She looked at herself in the mirror. Cynthia Young looked not a day over 20. We parked in front of the address and looked around. There was no salon anywhere in sight. The only thing in front of us was a newly renovated house. "This is the address," I said, looking at the card again. "Should we go back?" Miranda asked. I shook my head. Both Hannah and Abigail had this card in their possession when they died. We have to at least check it out. We knocked and waited. A young woman answered the door. "We're sorry to bother you," I started. "Do you know if there is a salon anywhere nearby?" She shook her head. "No, there are only houses here." "Right," I said. "Are your parents home?" Miranda asked. "No, this is my house," she replied. "I'm sorry, but you look young to own a house like this." "I assure you, it's my house." "We should be going," I said. "Have yourself a good night." The woman forced a smile and shut the door. When we were back on the street, I said, "What was that about?" Miranda said, "There was something off about that girl. It was the way she looked at us." "Yeah, she was surprised to see 2 detectives at her door this late at night," I said. Miranda shook her head. She pulled out her cell phone. "Who are you calling?" I asked. "The station." I waited until she hung up. "The house belongs to Cynthia Young," she said. "So?" "Look at the card." I did, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. "CY Beauty Salon," Miranda said. "Cynthia Young Beauty Salon?" My eyes widened. We are at the right address. We knocked on the door again, but this time we had our weapons drawn. No answer. We knocked harder. I looked over at Miranda. She motioned for me to go to the back. I moved to the side of the house. I tried to look through the windows, but the drapes were shut. I spotted a door which I presumed led to the backyard. I tried to push it open, but it was locked. I put my weapon away and pulled myself up and over the door. My feet touched something wet, and then I found myself sinking. I tried to fight it, but the more I did, the quicker I sunk. It was a trap. Miranda moved to the other side of the porch when she heard something. She turned and found the front door slightly ajar. She aimed the gun and entered. The house smelled old and stale. But it shouldn't, she thought. The front gives the impression that it has been spruced up. The interior made Miranda feel like she had gone 100 years back in time. The decor was early 19th century, but in good condition. She spotted a grand piano and an opulent chandelier, but what caught her eye were the large portraits hanging on the walls. Miranda was certain they were taken at different periods in time. Some were in color, while others were black and white. The portraits were of various men and women, but when Miranda looked carefully, she realized that it was the same person in each of the portraits. Cynthia Young. Miranda felt something sharp and cold on her neck. "Give me your weapon," she heard a voice say from behind her. She turned to find Cynthia standing before her. In her hand was a long sword. Miranda handed over her pistol. "How can you be in all those pictures?" Miranda asked. "I'll show you," Cynthia said with a smile. She took her down to the cellar. "You were looking for CY Beauty Salon," she said. "Well, here it is." Miranda realized the area below the house had been converted into a beauty parlor. "Is this where you hurt those girls?" Miranda said. "What, you think I did anything here?" she laughed. "Whatever happened to them happened in their own homes." "Then how did you do it?" Miranda said between clenched teeth. "Oh, you'll see." She walked over to an old cabinet and pulled out what looked like a mask. "Put this on," Cynthia said. "No," Miranda said defiantly. Cynthia shoved the edge of the sword into Miranda's shoulder. Blood came out and covered the tip of the sword. "I won't ask again." Miranda held the mask in her palms and slowly moved it toward her face. Before the mask touched her skin, Miranda threw it back at Cynthia. Startled, Cynthia looked away. Miranda took her chance and reached across and hit Cynthia across the face. The impact cut her skin. But then, right before Miranda's eyes, the skin instantly healed itself. Miranda stood frozen. Cynthia lunged at her with the sword. Miranda twisted and the blade missed her by inches. It struck the wall behind her. Cynthia turned and swung the blade. She missed and hit a table. Miranda shuffled back, trying to keep a distance between her and the sword. Cynthia swung again. Miranda ducked and the blade hit a mirror, shattering it on impact. Miranda stumbled back and lost her footing. She fell to the ground. Cynthia rushed over and raised the blade in the air. Miranda reached over and grabbed the mask in her hands. Not knowing what else to use, she held the mask up like a shield. When the blade came down, it sliced the mask in half. Cynthia screamed in horror. Her sword dropped to the floor as she clutched at her face. When she moved her hands away, it looked as if the skin had fallen into her hands. Cynthia howled in pain and agony. Miranda watched Cynthia Young's face bleed off, right before her eyes. I was almost shoulder deep in the mud when I spotted Miranda. "Help me," I pleaded. She looked around, found a rake, and offered the handle for me to grab onto. Luckily, I was able to free one of my hands and reach for it. Miranda pulled me out of the sinkhole. I was covered in mud and dirt. I breathed heavily. "Thank you," I said. "No problem, partner," Miranda replied. "What happened to Cynthia Young?" I asked, looking up at her. "Exactly what she did to her victims." After I got cleaned up, I got back in my Escalade. I called Detective Tanner again. I wanted to know if he had gotten the evidence I left for him. He picked up after several rings. "Detective Tanner," I said into the receiver. "It's Alex Weller." "Alex Weller," the voice on the other end said. It was not Tanner's. "Or do you mean Peter Murphy?" My blood froze. "I have Ian Tanner. If you want to see him alive again, you will come and meet me face to face." I was speechless. "If you come armed, I will kill Tanner." My heart was pounding. "If you tell anyone, I will torture him the way I tortured your best friend, Raymond Chan." The call ended. This has been Killing Them Gently, a supernatural mystery of horror and suspense. Written by Thomas Fincham. Narrated by Stephen Michael Preston. Copyright 2019 by Thomas Fincham. Production copyright by Thomas Fincham.